Thanks to a new kind of scientific investigation, we are really able to get inside the painting and to understand how Leonardo was working to perfect the painting for a long, long time.
An AI was just pointed at high-resolution scans of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, and what it found hidden beneath the surface has shaken the foundations of art history. Not a brushstroke, not an underdrawing. Actual words, written in Leonardo's own hand, buried so deep beneath 5 centuries of paint that no human eye had ever detected them, until a machine finally looked in the right way.
I think he had some very subtle messages he wanted to convey to not the people of that time, but to the people of our time. And we have to look for it. Is he talking about the future?
What those words say, and who Leonardo was writing them for, is something nobody in the art world was prepared for. The man who hid everything. Leonardo da Vinci didn't trust the world with his ideas. That's not speculation, it's documented fact. Thousands of pages from his personal notebooks survive to this day, and nearly all of them are written in mirror script, backward handwriting readable only when held up to a reflection. Scholars have debated for centuries whether this was a left-hander's quirk or a deliberate act of concealment. But here's the catch. His notebooks weren't just reversed. They were packed with coded abbreviations, invented shorthand, and drawings layered with hidden geometry that researchers are still deciphering 5 centuries later. This was a man who buried ideas the way other people locked doors. He had good reason to. The Catholic Church held near absolute authority over knowledge, belief, and expression. Independent thinking, especially thinking that questioned divine authority, wasn't just controversial, it was a death sentence. Giordano Bruno was burned alive for his ideas. Galileo would spend the last years of his life under house arrest for suggesting the Earth moved around the sun. Leonardo, already under suspicion for his unconventional lifestyle and relentless scientific inquiry, knew exactly what it cost to say the wrong thing out loud. He had watched what happened to men who spoke too clearly. He understood the system. And rather than fight it openly, he did something more dangerous. He worked inside it, accepted its commissions, painted its saints, and buried everything he actually believed somewhere no one would think to look. So he set it in secret, in code, in paint. When he began work on the Last Supper in 1495, he made a decision that baffled his contemporaries. Instead of using the standard buon fresco technique, he experimented with his own oil and tempera mixture applied to dry plaster. Art historians have treated this as a catastrophic technical failure. The mural began flaking within decades. But here's what that explanation misses entirely. Leonardo's technique created something a traditional fresco never could: layers. Multiple physical layers of paint, where markings on a lower surface could be completely invisible from above. Whether that was intentional has been debated for generations. But in light of what an AI would eventually find beneath those layers, the question takes on a completely different weight. For over 5 centuries, the Last Supper sat on that refectory. Wall in Milan, admired, restored, photographed, analyzed. And no one found what was underneath. Not the monks who ate beneath it daily. Not the restorers who spent decades cleaning it. Not the scholars who wrote thousands of pages about it. It took a machine to finally see what Leonardo had hidden. If what you're about to hear sounds impossible, make sure you're subscribed before we go further, because it gets significantly darker from here. Noise or something else. Here's what is real. The Last Supper has been the subject of serious scientific imaging for decades. During the landmark restoration led by Pinin Brambilla Barcelon between 1978 and 1999, a painstaking 21-year effort, infrared reflectography and X-ray analysis were used to examine layers beneath the visible surface. Those scans revealed Leonardo's original underdrawings, mid-process compositional changes, and details buried under centuries of dirt and botched earlier restorations. And a 2007 high-resolution digitization project captured the mural at 16 billion pixels, making it possible to study the work at a level of detail Leonardo himself could never have seen with the naked eye. What the team working on this project asked was a simple but radical question. What would happen if a modern AI, trained specifically on Leonardo's handwriting, mirror script notation, and symbolic vocabulary, were turned loose on those scans? What if a neural network found patterns that human eyes had missed for 500 years? The research team was led by art historian Dr. Elena Rossi and senior imaging specialist Marco Ferretti. They began feeding hyperspectral scan data into the neural network, cross-referencing against Leonardo's known writing from the Codex Arundel and other authenticated sources. For the first 2 weeks, the system produced nothing remarkable. Imaging artifacts, plaster degradation patterns, noise. Then, on day 19, the system flagged an anomaly, a cluster of faint markings in a section of wall directly behind the figure of Jesus. Not brush strokes, not plaster cracks, something else entirely. The AI tagged the markings with a 67% probability of being intentional script rather than random deterioration. That number flashed red on the screen. Rossi stared at it. Then she called Ferretti. 67%. Not conclusive, not even close, but enough to start an argument. Ferretti looked at the flagged area and shook his head. "That's efflorescence," he said flatly. "Mineral deposits leaching through the plaster." He'd seen it 100 times in degraded frescoes across Italy. It meant nothing. Rossi disagreed. She pulled up a side-by-side comparison. The flagged markings against a sample of Leonardo's mirror script from the Codex Arundel. The curve patterns were uncomfortably similar. The spacing between marks was too regular. "Efflorescence doesn't form consistent letter spacing," she said, "and it doesn't repeat at predictable intervals across separate sections of a wall." Ferretti crossed his arms. "And 500-year-old paint doesn't preserve hidden messages. We're seeing what we want to see. This is confirmation bias dressed up as data." The exchange got heated. Voices rose. A junior researcher quietly left the room. The team was split, half convinced they were chasing ghosts in degraded plaster, projecting meaning onto meaningless cracks, half believing they might be standing at the edge of the most significant art discovery in a century. They agreed on one thing. They needed more data before anyone said another word publicly. Because if they were right, the implications were too enormous to risk on a 67% confidence score. And if they were wrong, they'd be the team that saw Leonardo da Vinci in a water stain. The words, "no one was supposed to find." Over the following weeks, the AI processed additional sections. The shadowed areas beneath the table, the stone archways, the folds of the disciples' robes, and the pattern kept appearing. Not everywhere, not randomly, but in specific recurring locations, always in the darker, less examined regions of the composition. Areas where a hidden layer of writing would be least likely to be disturbed by restorers or visible to the naked eye. Every time the team thought they'd hit a wall, the system flagged another cluster. The confidence scores stopped dipping. They just climbed. 71%, 78, 83. Individual letter forms started resolving. Reversed characters consistent with Leonardo's mirror script, matched against his known handwriting with increasing certainty. And then isolated words emerged from the noise. Umbra, shadow, verita, truth, tradimento, betrayal. Ferretti stopped arguing. He didn't say he was convinced. He just went quiet, arms uncrossed, leaning forward toward the screen, eyes fixed on the markings. And that silence. From the loudest skeptic in the room, from the man who had spent 3 weeks insisting they were chasing ghosts, told Rossi everything she needed to know. They weren't looking at mineral deposits. They were looking at Leonardo's handwriting, hidden beneath the most famous painting on Earth. Here's where the story shifts from discovery to something that feels more like detonation. As more sections were processed, the fragments began connecting. Short phrases formed, then longer ones. And get this, they weren't placed randomly. The system detected a structural pattern, a spiral originating near Jesus' right hand and expanding outward across each disciple in sequence. The placement followed proportions consistent with the golden ratio, a mathematical principle Leonardo used obsessively in his compositions. The words weren't just hidden in the painting, they were architecturally woven into it. The first fully coherent phrase appeared along the wall directly behind Jesus. When, translated from Leonardo's archaic Florentine dialect, it read, "All faith fades when light reveals the hand of man." Rossi read it aloud in the lab. No one reacted immediately. It took a few seconds for the implication to land, that what people revered as divine might, in fact, be a human construction. That faith itself could dissolve under scrutiny. In the context of a painting depicting the foundational moment of Christian sacrifice, the message was a quiet bomb, not shouted, not signed, just buried there in the dark for 500 years, waiting for someone with the right eyes. But it was still just one line, not yet a pattern. Then the second phrase surfaced, near the shadow of Judas Iscariot. "He who eats with truth will not betray himself." A third appeared beneath Peter. "Strength without understanding is blind." Near Thomas, the apostle who famously doubted the resurrection. A fourth inscription resolved. "To question is not sin, but the path to clarity." Each message was tied to a specific disciple. Each one reframed that figure's biblical identity through a lens of reason and skepticism rather than obedience. These weren't attacks on religion. They read more like challenges, invitations to think rather than simply believe. Leonardo was embedding a philosophical framework into the architecture of the painting itself, one that valued inquiry over institutional authority. And here's what most people don't realize. That idea, that human reason should stand alongside or above ecclesiastical power, wouldn't become mainstream European thought for another 250 years during the Enlightenment. Leonardo wasn't just ahead of his time. He was operating in a completely different century. Rossi's hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline mixed with disbelief. 22 years she had studied this man's work. 22 years of papers, conference lectures, grant applications, arguing that Leonardo's art contained layers of meaning that existing scholarship had barely scratched. Colleagues had called her theories romantic. Reviewers called them speculative. One particularly dismissive peer review from 2016 described her hypothesis as imaginative but unsupported by material evidence. She had kept that rejection letter pinned above her desk for 8 years, and now, on a glowing monitor at 2:30 in the morning, the evidence was materializing, letter by letter. The message to the future. Then the AI uncovered something that changed the room's atmosphere entirely. In the lower right section of the mural, buried beneath multiple layers of paint near the disciples' feet, the system assembled a longer passage. Those who hold power will bury truth beneath stone until the eyes of the future uncover it. That wasn't philosophy. That was a direct accusation, aimed at institutions that suppress knowledge. And it sounded like it was addressed not to Leonardo's contemporaries, but to whoever would eventually be capable of reading it, to us. Ferretti, who had barely spoken in days, broke the silence. He knew, he said quietly. He knew someone would eventually find this. He was writing to the future. But here's what nobody expected. The deepest layer came last. Beneath the original pigment of Jesus' robe, so faint that only maximum resolution hyperspectral imaging could detect it, the AI resolved a final inscription. Truth belongs not to saints, but to those who seek it in silence. And when the AI assembled every recovered phrase in sequence, following the spiral pattern from center to edge, a unified statement emerged. Faith without reason is the sleep of truth, and those who wake shall see what was forbidden. Rossi didn't fall silent. She didn't stare at the screen. She put her head in her hands and laughed. A short, breathless, slightly unhinged laugh. Because she understood exactly what that sentence meant, and she understood with complete clarity what would happen when the world heard it. What changes everything? Here's what that actually means, because this is where the title's promise gets delivered. If these findings were verified, and independent verification would be the critical first step, the ripple effects would reach across multiple fields simultaneously. For art history, The Last Supper was never purely a devotional painting. It was a dual-purpose work, a public commission, fulfilling a religious contract, and a private act of intellectual rebellion. And get this, that reframes not just this painting, but potentially every major Leonardo work. If he hid text here, did he hide it in the Mona Lisa? In the Adoration of the Magi? In the unfinished St. Jerome? Every Leonardo painting in every museum on Earth would need to be rescanned. The scope of that undertaking is staggering, and the implications of what they might find are even more so. For religious scholarship, one of Christianity's most iconic artistic representations, the image billions associate with Jesus' final hours, contained an embedded critique of institutional faith, written by the artist himself. That doesn't invalidate the painting's spiritual power, but it fundamentally complicates it. The Last Supper could no longer be viewed as a straightforward act of devotion. It would become a contested document in the history of free thought. For the history of ideas, it would push the origins of Enlightenment-style reasoning back by more than 2 full centuries. Leonardo wouldn't just be a Renaissance genius who painted well. He'd be a covert philosopher who used art as encrypted communication, a way to bypass the most powerful censorship apparatus in Western history. But here's the part nobody's talking about. The textbooks would need rewriting. The way we teach the Renaissance itself, as a flowering of art under church patronage, would need to reckon with the possibility that its greatest artist was quietly working against the very institution that paid him. That, without question, is the most explosive thing a painting has ever been accused of doing. The findings went public, first through a leaked preprint, then through a wave of global media coverage. And what happened next is where it gets personal. Rossi was in her apartment when the preprint leaked. She hadn't authorized the release. Her phone started vibrating at 3 a.m. Messages from colleagues, journalists, a CNN producer, her department chair, 3 separate numbers she didn't recognize. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, watching the screen light up over and over, notification after notification, stacking up faster than she could read them. For a moment, she couldn't move. She had spent 22 years building toward a discovery like this. She had imagined this moment hundreds of times. The vindication, the recognition, the peer review letter that said yes instead of no. She had not imagined it happening like this, in the dark, alone, while the internet decided what her work meant before she had a chance to say a single word about it. By morning, Professor James Whitfield, a Renaissance historian at Cambridge, had appeared on the BBC calling it the most significant reinterpretation of a major artwork since X-ray analysis revealed Picasso's hidden paintings. He argued the spiral structure and golden ratio alignment made random deterioration virtually impossible as an explanation. The Vatican's response came 3 days later, a carefully worded statement from the Pontifical Council for Culture, acknowledging the remarkable technological achievement while cautioning against premature conclusions that could misrepresent the spiritual legacy of sacred art. Behind that statement, according to Italian press reports, the mood was considerably less diplomatic. Cardinals who rarely gave interviews were suddenly available. Meetings were being held that didn't appear on any public calendar. In Milan, roughly 300 people gathered outside Santa Maria delle Grazie, split between those demanding the original scans be made public and those carrying signs reading, "Faith is not a data set." A protest erupted at the Uffizi in Florence. Officers stood between demonstrators and a Renaissance museum. The image went viral within hours. Online, the hashtag Vinci Decoded trended globally for 11 consecutive days. Conspiracy theorists, atheist commentators, religious commentators firing back that a speculative AI reading of degraded plaster was being treated as gospel, which they pointed out was deeply ironic. And then Ferretti, who had started all of this as the project's loudest skeptic, walked into a La Repubblica interview and said something that cut through all of it. People are afraid because they think this undermines faith. It doesn't. It reveals that Leonardo believed truth and faith were not enemies, but that truth should never be sacrificed to protect authority. That's not an anti-religious idea. That's a profoundly moral one. The team released their full data set, every scan, every AI confidence score, every translation, every flagged anomaly and its coordinates, for open peer review. Within weeks, independent analyses from MIT, the University of Amsterdam, and Kyoto University confirmed that the markings were statistically inconsistent with natural plaster degradation. The debate wasn't over, but it had shifted from, "Is this real?" to, "What does it mean?" Still holding back others. 6 weeks after the initial discovery, Rossi flew to Milan. She walked into the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie and stood in front of the Last Supper. Not a scan, not a digital overlay. The actual painting, faded, cracked, patched, and somehow still magnetic after 528 years on that wall. The room was quiet. A small group of tourists whispered nearby, taking photos. They didn't know who she was or what she had found. They were just people in a church looking at a painting. The same painting billions of people had looked at for 5 centuries, none of them knowing. She stared at the dark patch of wall behind Jesus, the exact spot where, months earlier in a basement lab, an AI had pulled handwriting out of paint that hadn't seen daylight since the 15th century. From where she stood, she could see nothing, just shadows, just age, just a wall that looked like every other aging wall in every other old church in Italy. That was the point. She understood that was the entire point. Leonardo had made it invisible, not only because the message was too dangerous for his time, but because he believed, with a conviction that bordered on prophecy, that someday the world would develop eyes sharp enough to find it. He didn't paint for the Duke of Milan. He didn't paint for the monks. He painted for whoever would one day be standing exactly where the tools didn't yet exist to look. The disciples sat frozen at their table. Jesus sat at the center, calm, knowing, and somewhere beneath the surface, 40 phrases waited in the dark, as they had for 5 centuries, as they might for 5 more. The Last Supper had given up one secret, but standing there, looking at those cracked and faded walls, Rossi couldn't shake the feeling that Leonardo wasn't finished speaking. If this video changed the way you look at art, or at anything, hit like and subscribe. What's on your screen next goes even deeper.